The clock on Dante Morelli's desk read 2:17 a.m. when his phone vibrated against the polished mahogany surface. He didn't recognize the number, but in his line of work, unknown calls at ungodly hours were never good news. His thumb hovered over the decline button for a split second before something, instinct perhaps, or fate, made him answer. "Mr. Morelli?" The voice on the other end was female, professional, yet trembling with barely contained urgency. "This is Nurse Patricia from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about Elena Vasquez." Dante's entire body went rigid. The glass of whiskey he'd been holding suddenly felt like lead in his hand. Elena. The name alone had the power to dismantle every carefully constructed wall he'd built around himself over 33 years of surviving in the ugliest corners of New York City. What happened? His voice came out harder than he intended, each word a bullet leaving the chamber. "She's been shot, Mr. Morelli. 2 bullets. She's in surgery now, but—" The nurse paused, and Dante could hear the chaos of the emergency room bleeding through the phone, monitors beeping, voices shouting medical jargon, the mechanical whoosh of ventilators. "She's been saying your name, over and over. You're the only contact we found in her personal effects, aside from her mother, who's in Puerto Rico and can't get here until morning." Dante was already standing, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His men, scattered throughout the private club where he'd been conducting business, immediately straightened to attention. Marco, his second in command, moved toward him with questioning eyes. "I'm on my way," Dante said into the phone, his tone brooking no argument. "You keep her alive, whatever it takes. Money is no object. Get the best surgeons in the city. I don't care if you have to drag them out of their beds. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir. But Mr. Morelli, there's something else you should know. Tell me in person. I'll be there in 10 minutes. He ended the call and looked at Marco. "Clear my schedule. Everything. I don't care if the mayor himself is waiting. Cancel it." "Boss, what's—" "Elena's been shot." The name meant nothing to most of his crew, but Marco had been with Dante long enough to recognize the shift in his boss's demeanor. In all their years together, Marco had never seen Dante Morelli afraid. Angry, yes. Ruthless, certainly. But never afraid. Until now. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital took exactly 8 minutes. Dante's driver, Carlos, broke every traffic law in existence, the black Mercedes weaving through the sparse late-night traffic, like a shark cutting through water. Dante sat in the back seat, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. His mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each more violent than the last. Who would dare? Who would be stupid enough, bold enough, to touch her? Elena Vasquez had entered his life 6 months ago under circumstances that still haunted his dreams. His nephew, Little Marco Jr., named after his second-in-command, had been rushed to St. Mary's with complications from pneumonia that had spiraled into sepsis. The boy was only 4 years old, the child of Dante's sister Maria, and the closest thing Dante had to a son of his own. For 48 hours, the family had maintained a vigil in the pediatric intensive care unit, and it was there that Dante first saw Elena. She'd been working a double shift, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her scrubs adorned with cartoon characters that made the terrified children smile despite their pain. But it was her eyes that arrested him, warm brown depths that seemed to see straight through the expensive suit, the cold demeanor, the reputation that preceded him like a storm cloud. She'd looked at him and seen simply a man terrified of losing someone he loved. "He's going to be okay," she'd told Dante in the hallway outside little Marco's room, her hand briefly touching his arm. It was the first time in years anyone had dared touch him without permission. "I've seen worse cases pull through. Your nephew is a fighter. I can see it in his eyes." "How can you tell?" Dante had asked, desperate for any shred of hope. "Because he has your eyes," Elena had replied with a soft smile. And something tells me you don't know how to lose. She'd been right. Little Marco pulled through, thanks in no small part to Elena's tireless advocacy for additional treatments and her refusal to let the overworked doctors dismiss the child as just another case. When Dante had tried to thank her with a donation, a check with more zeros than most people saw in their lifetime, she'd handed it back to him with a gentle firmness that left him speechless. "Give it to the hospital if you want," she'd said. "But I didn't save your nephew for money. I saved him because that's what I do. That's what we all should do." In that moment, Dante Morelli, a man who'd built an empire on the principle that everything and everyone had a price, encountered someone who couldn't be bought. The realization had been both terrifying and intoxicating. After that, he'd found excuses to return to St. Mary's, anonymous donations that somehow always ended up funding the pediatric wing, new equipment that mysteriously appeared in Elena's unit. He'd even attended a hospital fundraiser, something so far outside his usual sphere that his men had thought he'd lost his mind. But it had given him the chance to see her in a different environment, to watch her laugh with colleagues, to observe the way children lit up when she entered a room. He'd never approached her directly again. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps some buried instinct of self-preservation, or maybe the recognition that someone like Elena Vasquez deserved better than the blood-stained world he inhabited. She was light, and he was darkness, and darkness had no business corrupting light. But now someone had shot her. Someone had dared to touch what he'd silently, impossibly, claimed as his. The Mercedes screeched to a halt outside St. Mary's emergency entrance. Dante was out of the car before it fully stopped, Marco close on his heels with 4 additional men fanning out to secure the perimeter. The automatic doors parted before him like the Red Sea, and the hospital staff took one look at the man in the $3,000 suit with murder in his eyes and wisely stepped aside. "Where is she?" Dante demanded of the first nurse he encountered. "Sir, you can't just— Elena Vasquez. Where is she?" The nurse's eyes widened with recognition, not of him personally, but of the type of man he was, the type who made demands, not requests. "Surgery. 3rd floor. But only family." Dante was already moving toward the elevators, his men forming a protective V behind him. A security guard made the mistake of stepping into his path, one hand raised in a placating gesture. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to—" Marco smoothly intercepted, flashing something that might have been a badge, but definitely wasn't. Whatever he said was low and fast, and the guard's face went pale before he stepped aside without another word. The 3rd floor surgical wing was a maze of sterile corridors and harsh fluorescent lighting. Dante emerged from the elevator to find Nurse Patricia waiting for him, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much suffering to be easily rattled. "Mr. Morelli," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Dr. Richardson is still in surgery with Elena. It's been 2 hours so far. Tell me what happened. Everything." Patricia glanced at the small army of men filling the hallway behind Dante, then seemed to make a decision. "Follow me. We can talk in the family consultation room." The room was depressingly familiar. Neutral colors, boxes of tissues strategically placed, furniture designed to be comfortable enough for long waits, but not so comfortable that people would want to stay. Dante had been in rooms like this before, delivering news that would shatter families. Now he was on the other side of that equation. Elena was leaving her shift at 11:30. Patricia began once they were seated. "She always parks in the west lot because it's closer to the pediatric wing. According to witnesses, there was a black SUV waiting near her car. 2 men got out. There was an argument. Witnesses say Elena looked frightened but was trying to stay calm. Then," Patricia's voice cracked slightly, "then someone else arrived. A man in a suit. The 2 men from the SUV drew weapons. Elena tried to run. That's when the shots were fired." Dante's blood ran cold. "How many shots?" "5 in total. 2 hit Elena, 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the abdomen. The others—" Patricia took a breath. The others hit the man in the suit. He's in surgery too. Critical condition. Who was he? We don't know yet. No ID on him. But Mr. Morelli, the police think Elena might have witnessed something. They're treating this as a targeted hit, not a random attack. Dante's mind was already racing through possibilities. A targeted hit near St. Mary's Hospital. 2 shooters. A third man who'd apparently tried to intervene, or maybe was the actual target. This had the fingerprints of organization written all over it. But whose organization? The police want to talk to you, Patricia added carefully. They know you have. Connections to Elena. Let them wait, Dante said flatly. His connections to Elena were minimal, peripheral, carefully maintained from a distance. But in his world, even minimal connections could be dangerous. Had someone found out about his interest in her? Was this a message? A challenge? Or worse? Had his presence in her life, however distant, somehow painted a target on her back? The thought made his hands curl into fists so tight his knuckles went white. If that was true, if his darkness had somehow reached out and touched her light, then every single person responsible would learn what true darkness meant. I need to see her the moment she's out of surgery, Dante said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Of course. But Mr. Morelli, you should know. The damage was extensive. Even if Dr. Richardson manages to stabilize her, the next 72 hours will be critical. There's a very real possibility that... No. The word came out like a gunshot. Don't say it. Don't even think it. She's going to survive. That's not a hope. That's an order. Patricia looked at him with something that might have been pity, or might have been understanding. I've been a nurse for 30 years, Mr. Morelli. I've learned that the human will to survive is sometimes stronger than any medical intervention. Elena is a fighter, and she was calling for you. That means something. Dante stood abruptly, unable to remain still any longer. He moved to the window, looking out over the sleeping city that never truly slept. Somewhere out there, the men responsible for this were breathing, living, thinking themselves safe. That would change soon. His phone buzzed. A text from Tony, his head of intelligence. Got the security footage from hospital parking lot. Sending now. Dante pulled up the video on his phone, his jaw clenching as he watched the scene unfold in grainy black and white. There was Elena, walking to her car, exhaustion evident in her posture after what had probably been another grueling shift. The black SUV pulling up. 2 men emerging, their faces partially obscured, but their body language spoke of military or professional training. Then the third man, arriving in what looked like a town car, moving quickly toward Elena. The confrontation happened fast. Words exchanged, the sudden draw of weapons. Elena turning to run, the muzzle flashes, Elena falling, the third man taking hits and going down hard. Dante watched it 3 times, memorizing every detail, every movement, every second. Then he forwarded it to Tony with a simple message. Find them. I don't care how. Find them now. Mr. Morelli? A new voice at the door. A man in surgical scrubs, mask pulled down, fatigue etched into every line of his face. Dr. Richardson. Elena is out of surgery. We've moved her to the ICU. She's stable, but I want her moved, Dante interrupted. To my facility, tonight. Dr. Richardson blinked. Sir, I don't think you understand. She can't be moved, not in her condition. The next few hours are... I have a private medical facility with equipment that makes this place look like a field hospital, Dante said, his tone brooking no argument. I have surgeons on call 24/7. I have security that can actually protect her. Because whoever did this might try again, doctor. And this hospital, with all due respect, is not equipped to stop them. Doctor. Richardson stared at Dante Morelli as if the man had just suggested performing surgery in the back of a moving vehicle. The doctor's surgical scrubs were still damp with perspiration from the 3-hour operation. his eyes bloodshot from concentration and the harsh fluorescent lights of the operating theater. Behind him, through the ICU doors, machines beeped in rhythm with Elena's struggling heartbeat. "Mr. Morelli," Dr. Richardson began, his voice strained with the kind of patience reserved for dealing with difficult family members. "I understand you're concerned, but moving a patient in Elena's condition would be incredibly risky. She's just come out of major surgery. Her vitals are barely stable. The trauma to her abdomen is exactly why she needs to be somewhere with better security and resources," Dante cut in, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that made everyone in the room instinctively step back. "Doctor, let me be very clear. The people who did this to Elena are not random criminals. This was a professional hit, and if they discover she survived, they will come back to finish the job. Can your hospital security stop that?" Dr. Richardson opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes flickered toward the standard hospital security guard, visible through the hallway window, a man approaching retirement age whose primary job involved checking visitor badges and escorting belligerent family members out of the building. "I didn't think so," Dante continued. "My facility has armed ex-military security, surgeons trained at Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic, equipment that most hospitals can't afford. And most importantly, it's a location that nobody outside my organization knows about. Elena will be safe there while she recovers. Here, she's a sitting duck." "Even if what you're saying is true," Dr. Richardson argued, though his conviction was clearly wavering, "the medical risk of transport alone will be minimized by the private ambulance with advanced life support that's already en route." Marco interjected smoothly from his position by the door. "ETA 15 minutes. Full medical team on board, including a trauma surgeon in case of complications during transit." Dr. Richardson looked between Dante and Marco, realization dawning in his eyes. "You'd already decided this before you even spoke to me." "I'm not asking for permission, doctor," Dante said, his tone gentling slightly. "I'm asking for your cooperation to make this as safe as possible for Elena. You care about her. I can see that. Everyone who works with Elena cares about her. So help me protect her." There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the ambient sounds of the hospital. Distant announcements over the PA system, the squeak of wheels on linoleum, the hushed conversations of medical staff changing shifts. Finally, Dr. Richardson sighed, the sound of a man recognizing defeat when it was inevitable. "I'll need to see your facility's credentials," he said, "and I want medical personnel from our team to accompany her during transport and stay with her for at least the first 24 hours. "Done," Dante agreed immediately. "Send whoever you trust. They'll have full access to Elena and all our resources. And if she deteriorates during transport, we bring her back here immediately. No arguments." "Agreed." Dr. Richardson shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was consenting to. "Give me 20 minutes to prepare her for transport and brief my team. And Mr. Morelli, if anything happens to that woman because of this decision, credentials and resources be damned, I will make it my life's mission to destroy you." Dante met the doctor's eyes without flinching. "If anything happens to her, doctor, you won't need to. I'll do it myself." As Dr. Richardson disappeared back into the ICU to prepare Elena for transport, Dante turned to Marco. "I want a complete security detail at the facility. 3 teams, rotating 8-hour shifts. Nobody gets in or out without my personal approval. And get Tony working on identifying those shooters. I want names, addresses, family members, favorite fucking coffee shops, everything." "Already on it, boss," Marco confirmed, tapping rapidly on his phone. "But there's something else you need to know. The police are here. Detectives. They're not asking nicely anymore about talking to you." Dante's jaw tightened. Police involvement was inevitable, but inconvenient. The last thing he needed was cops stumbling through his investigation, potentially tipping off whoever was behind the attack. But refusing to cooperate entirely would only make them more suspicious. "Where are they?" Waiting room, main floor, Detectives Sarah Chen and Michael Reeves. Chen's been with NYPD for 15 years, Reeves for 8. Both have solid records, not on anyone's payroll that we know of. A clean cops. That made things both better and worse. Better because they wouldn't be working against him on behalf of a rival organization. Worse because they couldn't be bought or intimidated easily. Tell them I'll give them 10 minutes after Elena is secured, Dante decided. And make sure our lawyers are standing by. I'm not answering anything without representation present. Marco nodded and moved off to make the arrangements, leaving Dante alone in the consultation room with his thoughts. Through the window, he could see the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Less than 4 hours ago, he'd been in his club, discussing import schedules and territory disputes, the routine mundanity of running a criminal empire. Now everything had shifted. Elena Vasquez was fighting for her life because of violence that had somehow found her in the one place that should have been safe, her workplace, her sanctuary, the hospital where she dedicated herself to saving others. The irony was bitter and sharp. Dante had spent months carefully maintaining distance from her, convinced that keeping away would keep her safe from the contamination of his world. Apparently, the universe had other plans. His phone buzzed. Another text from Tony. ID on third victim. Daniel Castellano, 42, attorney. Works for Whitmore and Associates. Corporate law. No obvious connection to Elena or the shooters. Still digging. Dante frowned at the information. An attorney. Corporate law. That didn't fit the pattern of a random mugging or even a standard mob hit. Corporate attorneys didn't usually find themselves in the middle of assassination attempts in hospital parking lots unless they were involved in something much deeper than contract negotiations. He texted back, "Find out what cases Castellano was working, who his clients were, and get me everything on Whitmore and Associates. I want to know if they've ever done work for any of the families." The families being the 5 major organized crime syndicates that controlled New York's underworld. Dante's family was one of them, the Morellis, who'd held territory in Lower Manhattan and the docks for 3 generations. But the other families were always looking for opportunities to expand, to consolidate, to eliminate competition. If one of them had made a move that accidentally caught Elena in the crossfire, the thought ignited a cold fury in Dante's chest. It was one thing to wage war against other criminals who'd chosen this life, who knew the risks and played the game accordingly. It was something else entirely to let that violence spill over onto innocents. There were rules, old rules, about keeping civilians out of the business. Those rules existed for a reason, partly practicality, partly the last vestiges of honor in a dishonorable profession. Whoever had violated those rules would learn what happened when you drew Dante Morelli's attention in the worst possible way. "Boss." Marco had returned, slightly out of breath. "Ambulance is here. Dr. Richardson is ready. They're bringing Elena down now." Dante stood immediately, straightening his jacket. "I want to see her before they transport her." "I don't think... I need to see her, Marco." There was something in Dante's voice that made his second-in-command simply nod and lead the way back to the ICU. They took the stairs rather than wait for the elevator, Dante taking them 2 at a time despite his dress shoes. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, a small convoy was already assembling. Dr. Richardson, 2 nurses, Elena on a gurney surrounded by monitoring equipment, and Dante's private medical team in matching dark blue uniforms that looked more like tactical gear than traditional paramedic attire. Dante approached the gurney slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter something precious. Elena looked impossibly small under the white hospital blankets, her face pale except for the oxygen mask covering her nose and mouth. Her dark hair had come loose from its usual bun, spreading across the pillow in tangled waves. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines, each monitoring a different aspect of her struggle to stay alive. But even unconscious, even broken, there was something inherently resilient about her. The set of her jaw, perhaps, or the way her hands rested at her sides. Not limp in defeat, but merely resting, gathering strength for the next fight. "She's a fighter," Dr. Richardson said, quietly, coming to stand beside Dante. "Stronger than she looks. The damage was extensive, but she held on through surgery even when—" He trailed off, but Dante understood what he wasn't saying, even when we didn't think she would. "How long until she wakes up?" "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. We've induced a medical coma to give her body time to heal. When we try to bring her out of it, depends on how well she responds to treatment." Dante reached out, his hand hovering over Elena's for a moment, before he allowed himself to gently touch her fingers. They were cool but not cold, still living, still fighting. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I promise you, Elena, you're going to be okay." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that he was sorry, that somehow his world had reached out and hurt her, despite all his efforts to keep her separate from it. Wanted to tell her that he was going to find everyone responsible and make them regret ever being born. Wanted to tell her that somewhere in the past 6 months, she'd become something he didn't have words for, something important enough that her pain felt like his own. But he said none of those things. Instead, he simply held her cool hand for another moment, before stepping back and nodding to the medical team. "Let's move." The transfer happened with military precision. Dante's team had clearly done this before, moving high-value targets who couldn't use traditional medical facilities. The private ambulance waiting at the emergency bay entrance was a Mercedes Sprinter customized with more medical equipment than some rural hospitals possessed. Dr. Richardson and Nurse Patricia climbed in alongside Elena, their professional skepticism visibly shifting to surprise as they took in the setup. "This is impressive," Dr. Richardson admitted grudgingly. "I've seen hospital ICU transports with less capability." "I told you," Dante said from where he stood outside the ambulance doors. "Money is no object when it comes to Elena's care. Whatever she needs, whoever needs to be hired, whatever equipment needs to be purchased, make it happen. I'll follow in my car." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away with a police escort that Marco had somehow arranged, Dante felt the weight of the past few hours finally settling on his shoulders. He was exhausted but knew sleep wouldn't come even if he tried. There was too much to do, too many pieces to move into position. "The detectives are getting restless," Marco said, appearing at his elbow. "And the sun's coming up. If we're going to talk to them, we should do it now before they decide to make this difficult." Dante glanced at his watch. 5:47 a.m. In another life, he might have been waking up now, preparing for a day of legitimate business. Coffee, shower, reviewing the morning news. Instead, he was covered in the sterile smell of hospitals, running on adrenaline and rage, about to talk to police about a shooting he had nothing to do with but everything to gain from solving. "Get the lawyers on a conference call," he instructed, "and make sure they understand. I'm cooperating fully with this investigation. I want whoever hurt Elena found and prosecuted." He paused, a cold smile touching his lips. "Well, found at least. What happens after that depends on how quickly the police move." Marco understood immediately. If the police found the shooters first, there would be arrests, trials, the slow machinery of justice. If Dante found them first, well, there would still be justice, just a different, faster kind. They made their way to the main floor waiting room where Detectives Chen and Reeves had been cooling their heels for the better part of an hour. Chen was a compact Asian woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Reeves was taller, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tired look that came from too many years seeing humanity at its worst. Both detectives stood as Dante entered, their body language professional but wary. They knew who he was. Everyone in law enforcement knew the Morelli name, even if they couldn't prove half the things they suspected. "Mr. Morelli," Chen began, her tone carefully neutral. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I'm Detective Chen. This is Detective Reeves. We'd like to ask you some questions about Elena Vasquez and the shooting that occurred in the hospital parking lot last night. Of course, Detective, Dante replied smoothly, gesturing to the chairs, though I should tell you up front, I wasn't present during the incident, and I'm not sure how much help I can be. Let's start with your relationship to Ms. Vasquez, Reeves said, pulling out a notebook. Hospital staff say you've been a regular visitor here over the past few months. Anonymous donations, equipment purchases, attendance at fundraisers. That's a significant investment for someone who claims to barely know the victim. I wouldn't say I barely know her, Dante corrected. Elena saved my nephew's life 6 months ago. I'm grateful. The donations were my way of showing that gratitude to the hospital and the pediatric unit where she works. Nothing more complicated than that. Chen leaned forward slightly. And yet when she was shot, you were called. Her phone had you listed as an emergency contact under the name Dante. Not Mr. Morelli or Marco's uncle or anything that would indicate a distant professional relationship. Just Dante. That suggests something more personal. Dante kept his expression neutral, though internally he felt a jolt at this information. Elena had listed him as an emergency contact. When had she done that? And why? They'd barely spoken beyond polite pleasantries in the hospital corridors. I'm as surprised as you are, Detective, he said honestly. Elena and I have only had a handful of conversations. Perhaps she had a reason I'm not aware of. Or perhaps you were closer than you're admitting, Reeves suggested, his tone implying things Dante didn't appreciate. Before Dante could respond to the implication in Detective Reeves's tone, his lawyer arrived. Catherine Walsh, senior partner at Walsh & Bingham, a woman whose reputation for aggressive defense made prosecutors wince and judges groan. She swept into the waiting room like a force of nature wrapped in a charcoal pantsuit, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Detectives, she said crisply, not bothering with pleasantries. Catherine Walsh representing Mr. Morelli. I understand you have questions, but before we proceed, I need to clarify something important. My client is here voluntarily, out of concern for Ms. Vasquez and a genuine desire to help your investigation. He is not a suspect. He has committed no crime, and any suggestion to the contrary will result in this conversation ending immediately. Are we clear? Detective Chen's expression didn't change, but Dante caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Nobody liked being managed by expensive lawyers, but Chen was professional enough to recognize the game. Crystal clear, Ms. Walsh. We simply want to understand Mr. Morelli's connection to the victim, and whether he might have any information that could help us identify the shooters. Then let's proceed on that basis, Catherine said, settling into a chair and nodding at Dante to continue. As I was saying, Dante resumed, Elena and I are not close in the way your question implied, Detective Reeves, but I have tremendous respect for her. She's dedicated, compassionate, and exceptionally good at what she does. When my nephew was dying, she fought for him like he was her own family. That kind of person is rare in any world, let alone in a place as overwhelmed and underfunded as a public hospital. So, yes, I made donations. And yes, I've been back to the hospital multiple times, but not to pursue Elena romantically or for any other personal agenda, simply to support the work she does. Noble sentiments, Reeves said, his skepticism evident. But you'll forgive us for being thorough. In our experience, when someone with your background takes an interest in a civilian, it rarely ends well for the civilian. Catherine's hand came down sharply on the table. Detective, that borders on slander. My client's background consists of legitimate business interests in import-export, real estate, and hospitality. If you have evidence of criminal activity, charge him. If not, stick to questions relevant to this investigation. Chen shot her partner a warning look before turning back to Dante. Let's approach this differently. Mr. Morelli, do you have any idea why someone would target Elena Vasquez? Any enemies she might have mentioned? Any unusual incidents or threats in recent weeks? Dante shook his head. Elena doesn't have enemies, Detective. She's a pediatric nurse. She spends her days saving children and comforting worried parents. The very concept of someone wanting to hurt her is absurd. And yet someone did, Chen pointed out. 2 professional shooters in a hospital parking lot. This wasn't random, Mr. Morelli. The preliminary investigation suggests Elena may have witnessed something significant enough to warrant silencing her. This aligned with what Nurse Patricia had mentioned earlier. What kind of something? Reeves consulted his notebook. We're still piecing that together. But there's a complication. The 3rd victim, Daniel Castellano, the attorney who was also shot. He's connected to a case involving Senator Richard Harwood. Castellano was preparing to testify before a grand jury about financial irregularities in some of the senator's campaign funding. Dante's mind immediately began connecting dots. Senator Harwood was a political fixture in New York, 3 terms in office, chairman of several influential committees, and widely rumored to have connections to various criminal enterprises. If Castellano was preparing to testify against him, and if Elena had somehow witnessed something related to that. You think the hit was meant for Castellano, Dante said slowly, and Elena was collateral damage. That's one theory, Chen confirmed, though there's another possibility. Hospital security footage shows Elena arriving at her car first. Castellano appeared maybe 30 seconds later. The shooters were already in position, waiting. It's possible Elena saw something she shouldn't have. Maybe the shooters getting into position, maybe some kind of preliminary setup, and Castellano's arrival simply complicated what was supposed to be a clean elimination of a witness. The thought made Dante's blood run cold. Elena hadn't been collateral damage. She'd been the primary target, at least initially, which meant the threat wasn't over, once whoever ordered the hit discovered she'd survived. Detective, Dante said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. How secure is your investigation? Are you confident that information about Elena's condition won't leak to whoever ordered this hit? Chen and Reeves exchanged glances. We're keeping details close, Chen said. But in a hospital setting with dozens of staff, complete information control is impossible. Why? Because if I were the person who ordered this, and I found out my target survived, I'd try again, immediately, before she can wake up and identify the shooters or testify about what she saw. Your facility, Reeves said, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's why you moved her. You're not just providing better medical care. You're hiding her. I'm protecting her, Dante corrected. There's a difference. And before you object on legal grounds, Elena is not a prisoner. She's a patient receiving world-class medical treatment in a secure location. The moment she wakes up and wants to leave, she's free to do so. But until then, I'm making damn sure nobody gets a second chance at killing her. Catherine placed a restraining hand on Dante's arm, a silent reminder to be careful about what he said. But for once, Dante didn't care about legal exposure. The police needed to understand the stakes. Detectives, Catherine interjected smoothly. My client is obviously emotionally invested in Ms. Vasquez's safety. That's admirable, not criminal. However, if you're concerned about witness security, perhaps we can discuss a formal arrangement. Mr. Morelli's facility is equipped with state-of-the-art security systems. With proper oversight from your department, it could serve as an effective protective location until Ms. Vasquez recovers enough to provide a statement. Chen considered this for a long moment. That would be highly irregular. So is a hit squad targeting a nurse in a hospital parking lot, Dante shot back. Regular procedures don't seem to be cutting it, Detective. How many officers can you spare for round-the-clock protection? 2? 4? And for how long? Days? Weeks? My facility has a full security team, all former military or law enforcement, working 3 rotating shifts. No gaps in coverage, no budget constraints, no jurisdictional issues. Tell me honestly, Can the NYPD provide better protection? The detectives couldn't answer because they all knew the truth. Police departments ran on stretched budgets and overworked officers. Providing the level of security Elena would need for an extended period simply wasn't realistic, especially if this case dragged on as investigations involving powerful politicians typically did. "We'd need access," Chen said finally. "Regular check-ins with Ms. Vasquez once she's conscious, updates on her medical condition, and if she chooses to leave your facility, that happens without interference." "Agreed to all of it," Dante said immediately. "Detective, I want the people who did this caught and prosecuted, but more than that, I want Elena safe. If working with your department helps accomplish both those goals, I'm all in." Reeves still looked skeptical, but Chen seemed to be calculating the practical benefits. "We'll need to run this by our lieutenant, but provisionally, we can work with this arrangement. In the meantime, Mr. Morelli, if you think of anything else that might help our investigation." "I'll call immediately," Dante promised. As the detectives gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Chen paused at the door. "Mr. Morelli, a word of advice. Whatever you're planning to do outside official channels, don't. We know your reputation. We know you have resources and connections we can't match. But if you go down that road, you'll compromise our investigation and potentially any future prosecution. Let us do our jobs." Dante met her gaze steadily. "Detective, I have no idea what you're implying. I'm just a concerned citizen trying to help a friend in need." Chen's expression said she didn't believe that for a second, but she simply nodded and left with her partner. Once they were gone, Catherine turned to Dante with a mixture of exasperation and professional concern. "Dante, please tell me you're not planning to do something stupid." "Define stupid." "Anything that involves violence, intimidation, or actions that could be construed as obstruction of justice." Dante stood, adjusting his jacket. "Catherine, you've been my lawyer for 12 years. Have I ever done anything you'd consider stupid?" "Yes, frequently, which is why you keep me on retainer." Despite everything, Dante felt a faint smile touch his lips. "Fair point, but in this case, I promise I'll be careful. Elena's safety is the priority. Everything else is secondary." "See that it stays that way," Catherine said, though her tone suggested she knew she was fighting a losing battle. "And Dante, the fact that she listed you as an emergency contact, that matters, whether you want to admit it or not." After Catherine left, Dante stood alone in the waiting room as dawn fully broke outside the windows, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. His phone buzzed continuously with updates. Marco confirming Elena's arrival at the facility, Tony sending preliminary reports on the shooters' identities, various underbosses checking in about the disruption to normal business operations. But Dante ignored all of it for a moment, focusing instead on the strange feeling in his chest. He'd built his life on control, controlling situations, people, outcomes. He'd learned early that emotion was weakness, that attachment made you vulnerable, that caring about anything too much gave your enemies leverage. Elena Vasquez had somehow slipped past every defense he'd constructed, becoming important to him without his permission or conscious awareness. And now she was fighting for her life because the violence he'd spent years containing had spilled over onto her anyway. The rational part of his brain knew this wasn't his fault. Elena had been caught up in something involving a corrupt senator and a whistle-blowing attorney. Nothing to do with Dante's world at all. But the irrational part, the part that had listed her in his phone under just her first name, that had made anonymous donations so he'd have excuses to visit the hospital, that had spent 6 months carefully not acknowledging how much he looked forward to catching glimpses of her in the hallways. That part knew differently. His world and her world had collided, and she'd been the one to pay the price. He pulled out his phone and called Tony. "Tell me you have something." "Working on it, boss," Tony replied, the sound of rapid typing audible in the background. The hospital security footage gave us partial plates on the SUV, running it through our systems now. Also made some progress on Castellano, the attorney. Guy was deep into the senator's finances. We're talking money laundering, shell companies, connections to the Bratva. The Bratva, the Russian mob. Dante's jaw clenched. If Russian organized crime was involved, the situation had just gotten exponentially more complicated. The Russians played by different rules, had different codes, and generally gave less of a damn about traditional boundaries between criminal business and civilian life. "Keep digging," Dante ordered. "I want to know every person involved in this, from the shooters on the ground to whoever gave the order. And Tony? I want to know who the senator uses for his dirty work. Which crews, which fixers, which corrupt cops. Everything." "On it, boss. But Dante? If we go after the Russians, even to defend our own, that's going to start a war. You sure you want to light that fuse?" Dante thought about Elena lying unconscious in a hospital bed, her life hanging by a thread because she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thought about her calling his name even as she fought for survival. Thought about the fact that she'd trusted him enough to list him as an emergency contact, even though he'd never given her reason to. "If that's what it takes," he said coldly, "then we go to war. But Tony, this one is personal. Spread the word through the organization. Elena Vasquez is under Morelli protection now. Anyone who touches her, threatens her, or even looks at her wrong answers directly to me. And make sure that message reaches our Russian friends too. They need to understand what happens when they mistake a nurse for acceptable collateral." "Understood, boss. I'll put out the word." As Dante ended the call and headed toward the exit where his car waited, he made himself a promise. Elena had saved his nephew's life once. Now he would save hers, no matter what it cost him. And once she was safe, once she'd recovered, he'd do something he should have done months ago. He'd tell her the truth about who he was, not the sanitized version he presented to the public, not the businessman facade he wore like armor. The real truth. What he did, the blood on his hands, the darkness he'd chosen to inhabit. And then he'd walk away, because someone like Elena deserved better than what his world could offer. But first, he had some Russians to find. The Morelli private medical facility occupied 3 floors of what had once been a boutique hotel in Tribeca. From the outside, it looked like any other renovated historical building in the neighborhood. Elegant brick facade, carefully restored period details, the kind of place that would house expensive lofts or a trendy tech startup. Nothing about it suggested the state-of-the-art medical center hidden inside, complete with operating rooms, ICU beds, and equipment that rivaled the best hospitals in Manhattan. Dante arrived 40 minutes after Elena's ambulance, having stopped at his apartment to shower and change. The blood-tinged smell of the hospital had been clinging to him, a constant reminder of how close Elena had come to dying. Now, dressed in fresh clothes and running on nothing but black coffee and adrenaline, he made his way through security checkpoints that would have impressed a head of state. Dr. Richardson and Nurse Patricia were standing outside Elena's room when Dante arrived on the 3rd floor, deep in conversation with Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the head of Dante's medical staff. Tanaka was a brilliant trauma surgeon who'd left a prestigious position at Johns Hopkins after becoming disillusioned with hospital bureaucracy and insurance company interference. Dante paid her 3 times what she'd made at Hopkins and gave her complete autonomy in medical decisions, an arrangement that had saved more than a few lives over the years, though rarely under circumstances this personal. "Mr. Morelli," Dr. Tanaka greeted him, her expression professionally neutral. "I've been reviewing Ms. Vasquez's case with Dr. Richardson. The surgery was excellent work, and the transport went smoothly. She's stable. All vitals are within acceptable ranges considering the trauma. I'm optimistic about her recovery, though the next 48 hours remain critical. Can I see her? Of course. But I should warn you, she's still in a medically induced coma. She won't be able to hear you or respond." Dante nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "Dr. Richardson, Nurse Patricia, thank you for saving her life and for trusting me enough to allow this transfer." I know it wasn't an easy decision." Dr. Richardson studied him for a long moment, as if trying to reconcile the dangerous man he'd heard about with the one standing before him, clearly exhausted and worried about a patient. "She matters to you," he finally said. "That much is obvious. Just make sure you're protecting her for the right reasons, Mr. Morelli. Elena deserves that." "She deserves a lot more than what my world can offer," Dante replied quietly. "But protection is something I can actually provide." Inside the room, Elena looked even more fragile than she had at St. Mary's, perhaps because the clinical efficiency of Dante's facility somehow emphasized her vulnerability. She was connected to fewer machines here. Dr. Tanaka ran a tighter operation with better technology, but the effect was still jarring. This woman who'd seemed so capable and strong when she was working, who'd faced down Dante's intimidating presence with calm professionalism, was now utterly dependent on machines and medications to keep her alive. Dante pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. Her hand was resting on top of the blanket, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it gently in his own. Her skin was warmer than it had been at the hospital, which he took as a good sign. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said softly, aware of how foolish talking to an unconscious person should feel, but finding he didn't care. "The doctors say probably not, that you're too deep under right now. But just in case, I wanted you to know you're safe. You're going to recover. And whoever did this to you, Elena, they're going to pay for it. I promise you that." He sat there for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing its usual meaning in the quiet of the room. His phone buzzed periodically with updates from his organization, but he ignored it. For once, the business of running a criminal empire could wait. A soft knock at the door announced Marco's arrival. "Boss, sorry to interrupt, but Tony's got something. He's downstairs in the conference room, says it's urgent." Reluctantly, Dante released Elena's hand and stood. He leaned down, surprising himself by pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'll be back," he whispered. "I promise." The facility's conference room was on the ground floor, a windowless space designed for privacy and security. Tony was already there, his laptop open on the table, surrounded by printed photographs and documents. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usual neat appearance disheveled, his eyes red from staring at screens. "Please tell me you have good news," Dante said, closing the door behind him. "Good and bad," Tony replied. "Good news first. I identified the shooters, Alexei Volkov and Dmitry Sokolov, both former Spetsnaz, both working as enforcers for the Kozlov Bratva. They're not subtle operators. Their specialty is intimidation and wet work, not surgical hits. Which explains why everything went sideways when Castellano showed up. They were sent to kill a nurse, not handle a complication." Dante studied the photographs Tony had pulled up. Two hard-faced men in their 30s, the kind of people who looked dangerous even in casual settings. "Where are they now?" "That's the bad news. Volkov's dead. Killed in what looks like a professional cleanup about 3 hours after the hospital shooting. Single bullet to the back of the head, execution style. Body was found in a warehouse in Red Hook. Sokolov's gone to ground. We're working on finding him, but he's smart enough to know he's next on the chopping block." Dante absorbed this information, his mind racing through implications. Someone's cleaning house, eliminating loose ends. Exactly. And there's more. Tony pulled up another file on his laptop. "I dug into Senator Harwood's connections like you asked. Turns out he's been taking money from Viktor Kozlov's operation for years. Campaign contributions laundered through legitimate businesses, personal favors, protection from investigations. In exchange, Harwood makes sure certain police operations get redirected, certain prosecutions don't happen, certain regulatory issues disappear. So when Castellano, the attorney, decided to testify about Harwood's financial irregularities, He was threatening to expose not just the senator, but Victor's entire New York operation. Tony finished. We're talking about RICO charges, asset seizures, international investigations, the kind of heat that could bring down the whole Bratva presence in the city. Dante leaned back in his chair, the pieces falling into place. And Elena? Wrong place, wrong time. Or... Tony hesitated, pulling up more documents. There's another possibility. Elena works in the pediatric wing at St. Mary's, right? Guess who else has a connection to that hospital? Senator Harwood's daughter, Emily Harwood. She's been receiving treatment there for leukemia. Top secret. Kept out of the press for political reasons. Elena would have had access to patient records, might have seen something, noticed something that connected the senator to Victor's operation. You're suggesting Elena was targeted because she might have been a potential witness, even if she didn't know she was one. I'm saying Victor doesn't leave loose ends. If there was even a chance Elena had seen something that could tie back to the senator, who ties back to the Bratva, Tony shrugged. They'd eliminate the threat. Dante felt his rage crystallizing into something cold and focused. Elena had been marked for death not because of anything she'd done, but simply because she existed in proximity to powerful people's secrets. The randomness of it, the casual cruelty, made his hands curl into fists. Find Sokolov, he ordered. I don't care what it costs or what you have to do. I want him alive. He's going to tell me everything about who gave the order, how the operation was supposed to go down, and what they planned to do if Elena survived. Everything. And then? And then he's going to disappear, permanently. But not before I make sure Viktor Kozlov understands what happens when you mistake a Morelli's people for acceptable targets. Tony nodded and began packing up his materials. Boss, one more thing. The cops are still investigating, which means we need to be careful. If we move too overtly against the Bratva, even in retaliation, it could blow back on us. Detective Chen seems smart. She's going to notice if Russians start disappearing or turning up dead. Let her notice, Dante said coldly, but make sure nothing leads back to us directly. I want this handled cleanly. And Tony, put out feelers with the other families. I want them to know what happened and that we're responding. If Victor has any sense of self-preservation, he'll offer compensation and cooperation. If he doesn't, Dante let the threat hang in the air. The next 2 days were a masterclass in controlled violence and strategic pressure. Dante divided his time between Elena's bedside and the systematic dismantling of Viktor Kozlov's operation in New York. It started small, a few key Bratva enforcers finding themselves arrested on outstanding warrants that suddenly became police priorities. Several profitable operations getting raided by cops who'd received anonymous tips about illegal activities. Nothing that could be traced directly to Dante, but the message was clear. The Morellis were applying pressure. Meanwhile, Dante's people worked the streets, following up leads on Sokolov's whereabouts. The missing shooter had gone deep underground, but even the best hiding places eventually revealed themselves to someone with enough resources and motivation. It was Marco who finally caught the break, tracking Sokolov through a girlfriend who worked at a Russian nightclub in Brighton Beach. We've got him, Marco reported on the third day after the shooting. Safe house in Coney Island, minimal security. Probably thinks he's beneath our notice with everything else going on. Bring him to me, Dante ordered, alive and able to talk. Beyond that, I don't care what condition he's in. The extraction happened at 3 a.m., quick and professional. Dante's team hit the safe house with overwhelming force, neutralizing the 2 guards before they could even draw weapons. Sokolov tried to run, but made it less than half a block before being tackled and zip-tied. By 4 a.m., he was in one of Dante's warehouses in Red Hook, the same neighborhood where his partner Volkov's body had been found. Dante arrived an hour later, having spent the previous evening reading to Elena. Dr. Tanaka had suggested that auditory stimulation might help patients in medically induced comas, so Dante had taken to reading aloud from a collection of children's stories he'd found in the facility's library. The same kind of stories Elena apparently used to calm frightened children in the pediatric ward. He'd felt ridiculous at first, sitting there reading about talking animals and magical forests to an unconscious woman. But there was something cathartic about it, something that kept his mind focused on the future where Elena would wake up and be okay, rather than dwelling on the violence he was about to commit. Now, standing in the warehouse with Dmitry Sokolov zip-tied to a chair in front of him, the contrast between those two worlds couldn't have been more stark. Sokolov was a mess. Bloody nose, split lip, one eye already swelling shut from where he'd resisted capture. But he was conscious and terrified, which was exactly what Dante needed. "Dmitry Sokolov," Dante said conversationally, pulling up a chair and sitting down opposite the Russian. "Former Spetsnaz, current enforcer for Viktor Kozlov, and recently employed as an assassin targeting innocent nurses. We need to have a conversation." "I want lawyer," Sokolov said in heavily accented English. "I know my rights. You cannot—" The backhand came so fast, Sokolov didn't see it coming. The impact snapped his head to the side, blood spraying from his reopened lip. "Let me explain something to you," Dante continued calmly, as if the violence hadn't interrupted his sentence. "You're not under arrest. There are no lawyers coming. There are no rights being violated here. This is simply one professional to another, having a conversation about choices and consequences. Your partner, Alexei Volkov, someone put a bullet in his head. That person was probably Victor, cleaning up loose ends. Which means right now you have two options." Dante leaned forward, his eyes locked on Sokolov's. "Option 1, you tell me everything. Who gave you the order to kill Elena Vasquez, why she was targeted, what the plan was if things went wrong, and anything else I want to know. In exchange, I let you live. Not free, not unpunished, but alive. I'll even throw in protection from Victor's people if you're worried about reprisal." "And option 2? Sokolov asked, though his voice was shaking now. "Option 2 is I let Marco here ask the questions." Dante gestured to where his second-in-command stood in the shadows. "Marco's very good at his job, but he's not as patient as I am. You'd eventually tell us everything anyway, but the process would be considerably less pleasant. So which option sounds better to you?" Sokolov was silent for a long moment, weighing his choices. Dante could see the calculation happening behind the Russian's eyes. Loyalty to Victor versus self-preservation. The oath of silence versus the very real possibility of dying in this warehouse. Finally, survival won out. "Okay," Sokolov said quietly. "I tell you, but you promise protection, yes? Victor finds out I talk, I'm dead, man. You have my word. Now start talking." The story that emerged over the next 2 hours was worse than Dante had feared. Elena hadn't been random collateral damage, or even a potential witness to some ancillary crime. She'd been specifically targeted after Emily Harwood, the senator's daughter, had mentioned to Viktor Kozlov during a private meeting that a nurse at St. Mary's seemed unusually interested in my father's visits. Elena, in her characteristic compassion, had apparently noticed how stressed Emily seemed and had asked if everything was okay at home, a completely innocent gesture from someone who cared about her patient's well-being. But to Victor and the senator, that innocent question had looked like suspicion, like potential exposure. They'd decided elimination was safer than risk, ordering Sokolov and Volkov to make it look like a mugging gone wrong. Castellano's arrival had complicated things. He'd apparently been meeting Elena to discuss her testifying about what she'd seen in patient records, though the attorney had been killed before the meeting could happen. "Victor was angry when we failed," Sokolov concluded. "Said we were sloppy, that we'd brought heat down on operation. Alexei, he was panicking, talking about running. That's when Victor had him killed. I knew I was next, so I ran first." Dante sat back, processing the information. Elena had been condemned to death for showing compassion, for doing her job well, for being the kind of person who noticed when others were in distress. The injustice of it made his blood boil. "One more question," Dante said. "Where does Victor operate from? I'm not talking about his public businesses. Where does he actually run his empire? Sokolov hesitated, and Dante saw the moment the Russian realized he'd already gone too far to stop now. Brighton Beach. Private club called Zoloto. Gold, in English. Has office and back, very secure. But Mr. Morelli, you cannot just walk in there. Victor has many guards, many connections. Even you. Let me worry about that. Dante cut him off. He stood and nodded to Marco. Get him secured somewhere safe. Medical attention, food, whatever he needs. But nobody knows where he is except us. If Victor's people come asking, Sokolov's dead, body dumped in the harbor. Understood? Yes, boss. As Marco led the prisoner away, Dante pulled out his phone and sent a text to Tony. Need a meeting with the other families. Tomorrow, neutral ground. Topic: Russian overreach and appropriate response. The 5 families, the major organized crime syndicates that controlled New York's underworld, didn't meet often. Their interests were usually more aligned toward competition than cooperation. But there were certain situations that transcended individual territory disputes. Civilians being targeted for death simply for doing their jobs? That was the kind of thing that could unite even traditionally rival organizations, if only because it threatened the delicate balance they'd all worked to maintain. If Dante was going to move against Viktor Kozlov and the Bratva, he needed to do it with the other family's blessing, or at least their neutrality. Otherwise, he'd be starting a war on 2 fronts, against the Russians, and potentially against Italian families who might see an opportunity to move against the Morellis while Dante was distracted. But first, he needed to check on Elena. Dr. Tanaka intercepted Dante as he stepped off the elevator onto the 3rd floor, her expression carefully controlled in the way of medical professionals delivering significant news. For a heart-stopping moment, Dante thought something had gone wrong, that Elena's condition had deteriorated, that he was too late. She's awake, Dr. Tanaka said, and Dante felt the tension drain from his shoulders so suddenly he almost staggered. We started bringing her out of the induced coma this morning. She regained consciousness about an hour ago, confused, as expected, but responsive and lucid. Vitals are stable. Mr. Morelli, she's asking for you. Dante didn't trust himself to speak. He simply nodded and moved toward Elena's room, his heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in his chest. Behind him, he heard Dr. Tanaka add, "Don't tire her out. She's still very weak and needs rest. 15 minutes maximum." Elena was propped up slightly in bed, the ventilator removed and replaced with a simple oxygen cannula. Her face was still pale, dark circles under her eyes testament to the trauma her body had endured. But her eyes were open, those warm brown eyes that had haunted Dante's thoughts for 6 months, and they tracked to him the moment he entered the room. "Dante," she said, her voice rough from the breathing tube. "They told me that I'm not at St. Mary's anymore." He approached slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. "You're at a private medical facility. You were shot, Elena. 3 days ago, in the hospital parking lot. Do you remember?" Her eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, there was pain in them that had nothing to do with physical injuries. "I remember. 2 men. They were waiting by my car. They asked me about Emily Harwood, about what I'd seen in her patient files. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about, that I couldn't discuss patients." She paused, breathing carefully around the pain. "Then there was another man. He tried to help me, and then gunshots. I remember falling. Pain, and then nothing until I woke up here." Dante pulled the chair close to her bedside, taking her hand gently in his. "The other man was Daniel Castellano, an attorney. He was killed. But you survived, Elena. You're going to be okay. How did I end up here? Where is here exactly?" This was the conversation Dante had been dreading. How did he explain without lying, but also without revealing too much? "This is a private medical facility that I own. After the shooting, I had you transferred here where you could receive better security and care. The doctors at St. Mary's agreed it was the safest option. Elena studied his face, and Dante could see her working through the implications. Security, because the men who shot me might try again. They won't get the chance, Dante said firmly. The shooters are no longer a threat. One is dead, the other is in protective custody, and the people who ordered the attack. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say I've made it very clear what happens to anyone who tries to hurt you. Something shifted in Elena's expression. Not fear exactly, but a kind of wary understanding. Who are you, Dante? Really? Because I don't think you're just a grateful uncle who makes generous donations to hospitals. He'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it, but it was still harder than he'd expected to find the right words. You're right. I'm not. Elena, my full name is Dante Morelli. Does that name mean anything to you? He saw recognition dawn in her eyes, followed by a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite read. Morelli. Like the crime family. Like the mob. It wasn't a question. Yes. I'm the head of the Morelli family. Have been for the past 8 years, since my father died. I run an organization involved in various illegal enterprises. Import-export mostly. Along with some other businesses I'm not proud of. I'm not a good man, Elena. I've done things that would horrify you. Hurt people. Worse than hurt them. But I need you to understand. I never wanted my world to touch yours. Never. I tried to keep my distance, to keep you safe from all of this. Then why did you keep coming to the hospital? Elena asked, her voice soft but steady. Why the donations? Why did I have you listed as an emergency contact, Dante? I've been asking myself that since I woke up. You had me listed as a contact? Dante asked, the question coming out more vulnerable than he'd intended. I didn't know that. I never asked you to do that. I know, but after you came to the fundraiser, I saw you talking to some of the children in the ward. Do you remember? There was a little girl, Sophia. She was terrified because she had to have surgery the next day. You sat with her for almost an hour, just talking to her about your nephew, how he'd been scared too, but everything turned out okay. You made her laugh, Dante. And I thought anyone who could be that gentle with a frightened child, anyone who cared that much, deserved to have someone they could call if they needed help. Dante felt something crack open in his chest. Elena, I don't deserve... Maybe not, she interrupted, surprising him with her directness. But deserving and needing aren't the same thing. You saved my nephew's life once, and now you've saved mine. Twice, actually. Once by having me moved here, and again by... She trailed off, her eyes searching his face. What did you mean when you said you've made it clear what happens to anyone who tries to hurt me? This was dangerous territory. Dante took a breath and decided on honesty, or as much honesty as he could give without completely horrifying her. The shooting wasn't random. You were targeted by Russian organized crime because they thought you might be a witness to something involving a corrupt senator. Once I understood that, I took steps to make sure they knew you were under my protection. That attacking you again would mean going to war with the Morelli family. Protected me, Elena repeated slowly. By threatening to start a mob war. If necessary, yes. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving slightly against his, where their hands were still joined. The doctors told me I was saying your name. When I was unconscious, fighting to stay alive. They said I kept calling for you. Do you know why that is, Dante? He shook his head, not trusting his voice. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, even unconscious, I knew you would come, Elena said softly. I knew you would make sure I was safe. I've known for months that there was something between us, some connection I couldn't explain. Every time you came to the hospital, I could feel you watching me from across the room, every anonymous donation that arrived. I knew it was from you. Every time I treated a child, I wondered if you'd hear about it somehow. Elena, let me finish, she said, her grip on his hand tightening despite her weakness. I'm not naive, Dante. I know what you are, what you do, and I know I should be terrified right now, or at least wanting to get as far away from you as possible. But I'm not. Maybe I'm in shock, or maybe the medications are affecting my judgment, or maybe. She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. Maybe I've been falling for you since that first night in the pediatric ICU, when you looked at your nephew with such love that I could see the man behind the reputation. Dante felt like the world had tilted on its axis. You can't feel that way about me. Elena, I'm dangerous. My world is violent and dark, and you deserve so much better than... Don't I get a say in what I deserve? Elena asked, a hint of her usual spirit breaking through the exhaustion. Don't I get to decide what I want, who I want to trust? Not if it puts you in danger. And being close to me, being important to me, that's the most dangerous thing you could do. He stood abruptly, pulling his hand away from hers despite how much it cost him. Elena, once you're recovered, I'm going to make sure you're safe. Really safe. New identity if necessary. Relocation. Money to start over somewhere far from New York and far from me. It's the only way I can protect you from the consequences of my life. And if I don't want that? Elena's voice was trembling now, though whether from emotion or exhaustion, Dante couldn't tell. If I want to stay here, in New York, living my life. If I want to see where this connection between us leads, then you'd be making a mistake that could cost you everything, Dante said, his voice harder than he intended. The people who tried to kill you are just the beginning, Elena. There will always be someone trying to use you against me. Always another threat, another danger. I can't put you through that. I won't. He turned toward the door, needing to leave before he said something he couldn't take back, before he gave in to the desperate urge to stay by her side and pretend they could somehow make this impossible situation work. Dante, wait. Elena's voice stopped him at the threshold. At least tell me one thing. When you were making all those threats to protect me, when you were tracking down the people responsible, were you doing that just because you're a good person who helps innocent victims? Or was there more to it? Dante stood there for a long moment, his hand on the doorframe, fighting with himself. Finally, without turning around, he said, There was more to it. So much more. But that's exactly why I have to walk away. Because caring about you makes you a target, and I'd rather live with that pain than risk your life again. He left before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, his eyes closed, trying to compose himself. Dr. Tanaka appeared beside him, her expression sympathetic. That looked difficult, she observed quietly. It was necessary, Dante replied, straightening up. How long until she can be safely moved? I want to make arrangements for her relocation as soon as possible. Physically? Another week at minimum, possibly 2. But, Mr. Morelli, I have to ask, is moving her really about her safety? Or is it about yours? Dante shot her a sharp look. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've worked for you for 5 years, and I've never seen you like this about anyone. You're planning to send her away not because it's the only way to keep her safe, but because it's the only way you know how to protect yourself from caring too much. Dr. Tanaka shrugged. Just an observation. But for what it's worth, sometimes the brave choice isn't walking away. Sometimes it's figuring out how to make an impossible situation work. She left him there in the hallway, her words echoing in his mind as he tried to focus on the more immediate problem. Viktor Kozlov and the Bratva. The meeting with the other family heads took place the following evening, in a private room at one of Little Italy's oldest restaurants, neutral ground that none of the families directly controlled. Dante arrived with Marco and 2 bodyguards, finding representatives from the 4 other major families already waiting: Angelo Russo, Tommy Battaglia, Frankie the Fish Pescatore, and Maria Conti, the only woman to ever head one of the 5 families, and possibly the most dangerous person in the room. "Dante," Maria greeted him with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We were surprised to receive your request for this meeting. From what we hear, you've been rather occupied lately." "Personal matters," Dante replied evenly, taking his seat at the table. "Which is actually why I asked you all here. The Russians have crossed a line." He laid out the situation in clear, precise terms: the attempted assassination of Elena, her connection to the senator and Viktor Kozlov's operation, and the broader implications of the Bratva targeting civilians for witnessing crimes they didn't even know they'd witnessed. He was careful to frame it not as a personal vendetta, but as a threat to all their operations. "If we let Viktor get away with this," Dante concluded, "we're telling every organization in the city that civilians are fair game, that the old boundaries don't matter anymore. How long before one of your people gets caught in crossfire? How long before families start suffering because we couldn't maintain basic codes of conduct?" Angelo Russo, the oldest and most traditional of the family heads, nodded slowly. "The boy makes a good point. There's a reason we've always kept civilians out of our business. Start targeting nurses and teachers and accountants just because they might have seen something, and pretty soon the whole city turns against us. The cops get public support for crackdowns. Politicians make examples of us. It's bad for everyone." "But," Tommy Battaglia countered, "declaring war on the Bratva over one woman? That's a steep price for principle, Dante. Viktor's operation brings in millions every year. He's got connections to Eastern European networks we can't match. You really want to pick that fight?" "I'm not asking permission to go to war," Dante said carefully. "I'm informing you that I'm moving against Viktor with or without your support. But if the 5 families present a united front on this, Viktor will back down. He's not stupid. He knows he can't fight all of us simultaneously and survive. Give me your backing, and this ends without a shot being fired. Refuse, and yes, there will be war. But it won't just be my problem. Viktor will see the division as weakness, and he'll expand into all our territories while we're distracted." Maria Conti had been silent throughout the discussion, but now she leaned forward, her dark eyes assessing Dante with unsettling intensity. "This woman, this nurse, she's more than just principal to you, isn't she? You care about her, personally." There was no point in lying. "Yes. And if we back you on this, if we help you pressure Viktor into compensation and a guarantee of no further action, what happens then? Do you keep this woman in your life? Make her a target for every ambitious punk who thinks hurting your girlfriend will give them leverage? Or do you do the smart thing and send her away?" Dante felt the weight of everyone's attention on him. This was the real question, the one that determined whether the other families would see him as rational or compromised. A mob boss who could be manipulated through personal attachments was a weak boss, a liability. "I'm sending her away," he said, and was surprised by how much it hurt to say it out loud. "Once she's recovered, I'm setting her up with a new life far from New York. New identity, financial security, protection but from a distance. She'll be safe, and she'll be free of any connection to me or this life." Maria studied him for another long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll support your move against Viktor, not because I give a damn about your personal life, but because he's right." She gestured to Angelo. "The Russians are getting too bold. Better to remind them now where the boundaries are." One by one, the other family heads agreed. Not enthusiastically, but with enough consensus that Dante knew he had what he needed. They would approach Viktor together, make it clear that his actions were unacceptable, and that further moves against Elena or any other civilians would result in a united response from the Italian families. It was more than Dante had hoped for, and exactly what he'd needed. The meeting with Viktor Kozlov happened 2 days later in yet another neutral location, this time a warehouse in Queens that had seen its share of negotiations over the years. Viktor arrived with his own entourage, a bear of a man in his 50s with cold eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness that matched Dante's own. "Morelli," Viktor greeted him in heavily accented English. "I hear you've been making waves, killing my men, disrupting my operations. This is not friendly behavior between business associates." "We're not associates," Dante replied coldly. "Associates don't target civilians. Your men tried to kill a nurse, Viktor. An innocent woman whose only crime was being good at her job. That violates every code we operate under." Viktor waved a dismissive hand. "Collateral damage, sometimes unavoidable in our line of work. Not when the collateral is someone under Morelli protection, and not when it brings unnecessary heat down on all of us." Dante leaned forward. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to make a formal apology to the 5 families for overstepping. You're going to pay compensation, $2 million to be split among various civilian protection funds we'll establish. And you're going to guarantee, on pain of your entire operation being dismantled, that Elena Vasquez and anyone else she cares about are completely off limits. Forever." "And if I refuse?" Viktor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then the 5 families move against you together. Your operations get shut down, your people get arrested or worse, and your connections back to Moscow won't be able to help you fast enough. You're a smart man, Viktor. Do the math." The silence stretched for a long moment before Viktor finally nodded, his expression sour. "Fine. 2 million formal apology. The woman is untouchable. But Morelli, you should know, this kind of weakness, caring about civilians, it will get you killed someday. Men like us, we don't get happy endings." "Maybe not," Dante agreed. "But at least I'll die knowing I tried to protect something good instead of just destroying it." As he left the warehouse, Dante felt the weight of the past week finally catching up to him. It was done. Elena was safe, truly safe now, protected by agreements that transcended any single family or organization. Viktor would honor the deal because the alternative was his own destruction, and the other families would enforce it because they'd all agreed to it. Now came the hard part, keeping his promise to send Elena away. Elena was sitting up when Dante returned to her room at the facility, color finally returning to her cheeks. 2 weeks had passed since the shooting, and Dr. Tanaka had declared her recovery remarkable, though still requiring another week of monitored care before she'd be medically cleared to leave. Physical therapy had begun, helping Elena regain strength after the extended bed rest. She looked up when Dante entered, and something in her expression told him she'd been expecting him. "You've been avoiding me," she said without preamble. "Dr. Tanaka said you've been checking on my condition but only coming by when I'm asleep or in therapy." Dante couldn't deny it. "I've been handling business, making sure the threat against you is neutralized." "Is it?" Elena asked. "Neutralized?" "Yes, completely. You're safe now, Elena. The people who wanted to hurt you have been dealt with, and I've secured agreements that guarantee your protection going forward. No one from the Russian organization or anyone else will come after you." Relief flickered across her face, but it was quickly replaced by something more guarded. "That's good, thank you. So what happens now?" This was the conversation Dante had been dreading. He pulled up the familiar chair beside her bed, but this time kept more physical distance between them. "Now you recover. Finish your physical therapy, and then I help you start over. New city, new identity if you want it, enough money to live comfortably while you figure out your next steps. I have people who specialize in this kind of thing. Witness protection, essentially, but better funded and more thorough." "You're sending me away." Elena's voice was flat, carefully controlled. "I'm giving you your life back," Dante corrected. A life free from the danger that comes from being associated with me. What if I don't want that life? Elena asked, and there was steel underneath the calm. What if I want to stay in New York, keep working at St. Mary's, see where things go with the man who saved my life? Then you'd be making a mistake, Dante said firmly. Elena, I've spent the past 2 weeks securing your safety from external threats, but I can't protect you from the inherent danger of my world. There will always be another rival organization, another political situation, another complication that could put you in the crossfire. The only way to truly keep you safe is distance. You're a coward. The words were quiet, but devastating. Dante flinched as if she'd struck him. What? Elena sat up straighter, her eyes blazing with an emotion Dante couldn't quite name. You heard me. You're a coward, Dante Morelli. You're willing to threaten mob bosses, start wars, face down armed killers, but you're terrified of admitting that you care about me, that you might actually want something beyond revenge and power and control. That's not— Yes, it is, Elena interrupted. You're hiding behind this noble sacrifice routine, telling yourself you're protecting me by pushing me away. But really, you're protecting yourself. Because if I stay, if we try to make this work, you might actually have to be vulnerable. You might have to admit that the big bad mob boss has feelings, and that terrifies you more than any enemy ever could. Dante stood abruptly, anger and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope, warring in his chest. You don't understand what you're asking for. Then explain it to me, Elena demanded. Stop making decisions for me and talk to me like I'm a person with agency, not some fragile thing that needs to be locked away for safekeeping. I'm a pediatric nurse, Dante. I deal with life and death situations every day. I make impossible choices about treatment and care. I'm not as helpless as you seem to think. I never said you were helpless, but you're treating me like I am. Like I can't possibly understand the risks or make my own decisions about what I'm willing to accept. Elena's voice softened slightly. I know your world is dangerous. I know being with you would mean accepting risks that most people never have to consider. But Dante, life is risky. Children get cancer. Good people get shot in parking lots. There are no guarantees for anyone, mob boss or pediatric nurse. Dante turned to face the window, unable to meet her eyes while his carefully constructed defenses were crumbling. My father used to say that our kind doesn't get to have normal lives. That love is a luxury we can't afford because it makes us weak, gives our enemies leverage. I watched him push away every genuine connection he ever had, turn himself into this cold, isolated figure, and I swore I wouldn't be like him. But maybe he was right. Maybe caring about someone the way I care about you is exactly the kind of weakness that gets people killed. Or maybe, Elena said softly, caring about someone is what makes us human, what separates us from the monsters we're afraid of becoming. Silence filled the room, broken only by the ambient sounds of the medical facility. Finally, Dante spoke without turning around. When you were in surgery, fighting for your life, I made a promise. I told you, even though you couldn't hear me, that I would make sure you were safe, that I would take care of the people responsible and protect you from any future threat. I've kept that promise, Elena. The question is, how do I protect you from the biggest threat of all, which is me? You don't, Elena replied simply. You let me decide if being with you is worth the risk. You give me information, honesty, and trust that I'm adult enough to make my own choices. And then you accept whatever I decide, even if it's not what you think is best for me. Dante finally turned to face her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since all of this began. Elena Vasquez wasn't some innocent victim who needed saving. She was strong, capable, and determined. Someone who'd chosen a career dedicated to saving others, despite the emotional toll. someone who'd face down danger with courage instead of surrender. She deserved better than his assumptions about what she could handle. "If you stay," he said carefully, "if we try to make this work, there will be rules, security measures, things you'll have to accept about how I live and what I do. I can't change who I am, Elena. I can't suddenly become legitimate or leave my family business, not without starting a war that would endanger everyone I'm responsible for." "I'm not asking you to change who you are," Elena replied. "I'm asking you to let me in, to stop trying to protect me from yourself, and trust that I know what I'm getting into." "You don't, though," Dante insisted. "You can't possibly understand what it means to be involved with someone like me. The surveillance, the threats, the constant awareness that someone might try to use you as leverage, the knowledge that people I've hurt might seek revenge through you. That's not a life, Elena. That's a prison. And yet you live it every day," Elena pointed out. "Your sister lives it, your nephew, everyone in your organization. If they can find meaning and connection despite those risks, why can't I?" "Because I couldn't survive losing you," Dante thought but didn't say. "Because you've become the thing I care about most. And that makes you the most dangerous vulnerability I have." But looking at Elena, seeing the determination in her eyes and the set of her jaw, Dante realized that continuing to push her away wasn't noble. It was selfish. He was making decisions based on his own fear, not her actual needs or desires. And if there was one thing Dante had learned in his years running the family, it was that fear-based decisions rarely led anywhere good. "All right," he said finally, returning to sit beside her bed. "If you're sure about this, if you really want to try, then we do it carefully. Security detail whenever you leave the facility. Background checks on anyone new in your life. Regular sweeps of your apartment for bugs or tracking devices. You'll hate it, Elena. It'll feel invasive and paranoid and exhausting." "Probably," Elena agreed. "But I'll hate being shipped off to some random city to start over even more. And I'll regret not taking this chance for the rest of my life." Dante took her hand, marveling at how such a simple gesture could feel so significant. "I don't know how to do this. Relationships, normal ones where people care about each other and aren't constantly preparing for betrayal or attack. My world doesn't have a roadmap for that." "Then we'll figure it out together," Elena said, squeezing his hand gently. "One day at a time. Starting with you actually visiting me when I'm awake, instead of sneaking in while I'm asleep like some kind of worried ghost." Despite everything, Dante felt a smile tugging at his lips. "I wasn't sneaking. I was. Checking on your condition." "You were reading to me," Elena corrected. "Dr. Tanaka told me. Children's stories. She said you'd sit for hours just reading aloud even though I couldn't respond." Dante felt heat rise in his cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation that he recognized as embarrassment. The doctor suggested auditory stimulation might help with recovery. "Uh-huh. And which doctor suggested reading fairy tales specifically?" "You used to read those to the children in the pediatric ward," Dante admitted, "to calm them down when they were scared, I thought." He trailed off, unsure how to articulate what he'd been thinking during those long hours by her bedside. "You thought they might comfort me too," Elena finished softly. "That's possibly the sweetest thing anyone's ever done for me." "Don't get used to it," Dante said, but there was no heat in his words. "I have a reputation to maintain." "Right, big scary mob boss. Can't have anyone knowing you have a heart." "Exactly." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Elena asked, "So what happens now? I mean, practically speaking. When I'm cleared to leave here, do I go back to my apartment? Back to work?" Dante had been thinking about this. "Your apartment isn't secure enough. I'd prefer you stay in a property I control, somewhere with better security infrastructure. As for work, that's your decision. But St. Mary's might not be safe for a while. Even with the agreements in place, Returning to the exact location where you were targeted could invite trouble. I'm not abandoning my patients, Elena said firmly. Those children depend on me. Their families depend on me. I can't just disappear because something bad happened. I'm not asking you to abandon them permanently. Just take some time. Let things settle. Maybe transfer to a different hospital unit where you're less visible. Dante paused, then added carefully. Or there's another option. I mentioned before that I've been making donations to St. Mary's. What if those donations came with a condition? That the hospital create a new program for at-risk children, something that operates outside the normal hospital structure. You could run it, work with the same patient population, but with more security built in. Elena considered this. A private clinic? Funded by mob money? Funded by money that could be doing a lot worse things, Dante corrected. Money that could actually help children instead of other purposes. It would be legitimate, fully licensed, everything above board, just with better security than a typical clinic. You've really thought about this. I've had 2 weeks to think about nothing but how to keep you safe while still letting you do the work you love. This seemed like a compromise. Elena was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, I'd want to see the details, make sure the medical side is properly structured. But yeah, that could work. It would actually be amazing. We could provide services to families who fall through the cracks of the regular healthcare system. Exactly. Dante felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. So, we have a plan. You finish recovering here, then we set up proper security at a new location. Meanwhile, we work on establishing the clinic. Give it 6 months, maybe a year, before you consider returning to St. Mary's directly. And us? Elena asked. What's the plan there? Dante met her eyes, seeing both vulnerability and hope in them. Honestly, I have no idea. I've never done this before, caring about someone enough to want to protect them from myself. So we take it slow, figure it out as we go. I'll try not to be too overbearing with the security measures. You try not to take unnecessary risks. And we both try to be honest about what we want and what we're afraid of. That sounds surprisingly healthy for a relationship starting under these circumstances. Don't get too excited. I'll probably screw it up somehow. I'm not exactly known for emotional intelligence or healthy communication. Elena laughed, the sound surprising both of them. It was the first time Dante had heard her laugh since before the shooting, and it was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Well, lucky for you, I'm extremely patient. Comes with the job. You can't work with sick children without learning patience. I'm not a child, Dante protested. No, but you're definitely wounded, emotionally at least, and helping wounded things heal is kind of my specialty. Dante wanted to argue, to insist he wasn't wounded or broken or in need of healing. But looking at Elena, seeing the warmth and acceptance in her eyes, he found he couldn't. Maybe he was wounded. Maybe his father's cold isolation and his mother's early death and all the violence he'd witnessed and committed had left scars that ran deeper than he'd ever acknowledged. And maybe, just maybe, letting someone try to help heal those wounds wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the bravest thing he'd ever done. You know what I remembered while I was unconscious? Elena said suddenly. That fundraiser you attended at the hospital. You were so out of place among all the doctors and administrators and wealthy donors. Everyone could tell you didn't really belong in that world. But then you spent the entire evening talking to the patients, the children we'd invited to show what the hospital was doing. You ignored the wealthy donors and the politicians and just sat with kids, asking about their treatments and their lives. I watched you, and I thought, that's someone who understands what really matters. I hate fundraisers, Dante admitted. All that forced socializing and small talk. But the kids were genuine. They didn't care who I was or what I did. They just wanted someone to listen. Exactly. And that's why I started falling for you. Because underneath all the power and reputation and control, you're someone who cares about protecting the vulnerable. You just show it in different ways than most people. Dante felt something unfamiliar and uncomfortable in his chest. Vulnerability, maybe, or hope, or both. I don't know if I can be the person you seem to think I am, Elena. You don't have to be anyone other than who you are. That's enough. Over the next week, as Elena continued her recovery, and Dante arranged the various practical matters involved in their new arrangement, something shifted between them. The awkward distance that had characterized their relationship before the shooting gave way to easier conversation, shared silences that felt comfortable rather than tense, and a growing sense of partnership. Dante found himself sharing details about his life he'd never told anyone outside his immediate family. The pressure of leadership, the weight of being responsible for hundreds of people's livelihoods, the constant balancing act between violence and restraint. Elena listened without judgment, offering perspectives that were refreshingly different from the typical mob mentality Dante dealt with daily. In turn, Elena opened up about her own struggles, the emotional toll of working with dying children, the burnout that plagued pediatric healthcare workers, the guilt she felt when she couldn't save everyone. Dante recognized in her stories the same kind of survivor's burden he carried, the knowledge that you'd done your best, but it sometimes wasn't enough. They were, he realized, more similar than they'd initially appeared. Both dedicated to protecting those weaker than themselves. Both willing to make personal sacrifices for people under their care. Both scarred by the impossibility of saving everyone. The difference was that Elena channeled her dedication into healing, while Dante's path had led to violence. But maybe, those paths could coexist without destroying each other. On Elena's last day at the facility, before she transferred to the secure apartment Dante had arranged in Tribeca, Dr. Tanaka did a final examination and declared her medically cleared for discharge with continued outpatient follow-up. "You've healed remarkably well," Dr. Tanaka told Elena. "Both physically and, from what I can see, emotionally. Whatever Mr. Morelli is doing, it seems to be working." After the doctor left, Elena turned to Dante with a slight smile. "She thinks you're good for me." "She's probably the only one," Dante replied. "My own people think I've lost my mind, getting involved with a civilian. The other families think I'm showing weakness. And your co-workers." He trailed off. "My co-workers don't know," Elena finished. "And they don't need to. This is my life, my choice. What anyone else thinks about it is irrelevant." As they prepared to leave the facility, Dante's phone buzzed with a message from Marco. "Everything's ready. Apartment secured. Security team in place. Welcome home." Home. The word felt strange in this context. The Tribeca apartment had been purchased months ago as a safe house, a backup location for when primary properties were compromised. But now it would be Elena's home. And by extension, a place where Dante could be something other than just the boss. A place where he could be simply Dante, the man who'd fallen for a nurse who saved lives while he took them. The apartment was on the top floor of a renovated warehouse building, with 3 bedrooms, high ceilings, and windows overlooking the Hudson River. Marco had overseen the furnishing personally, working from a list Elena had provided of essentials and preferences. The result was surprisingly homey. Nothing like the sterile luxury of Dante's usual properties, but rather a space that felt like it could actually be lived in. "It's perfect," Elena said, walking through the rooms with obvious delight. "Marco has surprisingly good taste in furniture." "Don't tell him that," Dante warned. "He'll never let me hear the end of it." Elena turned to face him, her expression turning more serious. "Dante, I know this is a huge adjustment for both of us, and I know you're probably terrified that I'm going to get hurt again, or that this whole thing is a mistake. But I want you to know, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever challenges come, we face them together. That's what this means." Dante crossed the room to stand in front of her, close enough to touch but not quite doing so. "I've spent my entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of commitment. This kind of vulnerability. Do you have any idea how terrifying you are to me?" "Good," Elena replied, reaching up to touch his face gently. "You should be terrified. It means you care enough for it to matter. And Dante? You're terrifying to me too. But that's okay. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones that scare us most." He kissed her then, finally giving in to the impulse he'd been suppressing for months. It was gentle and careful, mindful of her still healing injuries, but no less meaningful for that. Elena's arms came up around his neck, holding him close. And for the first time since this all began, Dante allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could actually make this work. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Elena rested her forehead against his. "So what happens now? I mean, after we've had our dramatic kiss scene and everything." "Now," Dante smiled, genuinely smiled, in a way he couldn't remember doing in years. "Now we live. You heal. I figure out how to run a criminal empire while maintaining a relationship with someone who reminds me every day why some things are worth protecting. We make mistakes, probably a lot of them. We argue about security protocols and my overprotective tendencies and your stubborn insistence on taking risks I don't approve of." "Sounds perfect," Elena said, and the scary thing was, she actually seemed to mean it. 3 months later, the Elena Vasquez Pediatric Care Center opened its doors in a renovated building in the Bronx. Funded through a complex series of legitimate Morelli business holdings, the clinic provided free and low-cost healthcare to underserved children throughout New York City. Elena ran it with the same passionate dedication she'd brought to St. Mary's, but now with resources and support that had been impossible in the overworked hospital system. Dante attended the opening ceremony, standing in the back of the room as Elena gave a speech thanking the donors, never mentioning him by name, respecting the boundaries they'd agreed upon. But as she talked about providing care for the most vulnerable among us and creating a safe place where children can heal, her eyes found his in the crowd, and the look they shared said everything that couldn't be spoken aloud. That evening, as they sat in the Tribeca apartment reviewing the day's success, Elena leaned against Dante's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You know what the best part of today was?" "What?" "Seeing the faces of those kids' parents when we told them they wouldn't have to choose between rent and their child's medical care. Like we'd given them back hope." She paused, then added quietly, "That's what you've done for me too, in a way. Given me back hope that good things can exist even in dark situations." Dante pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You're the good thing, Elena. I'm just the dark situation trying not to ruin it." "You haven't ruined anything. You've actually made my life better. Better than I ever expected it could be. Safer, sure, with all your security measures that drive me crazy. But also fuller, richer. You've shown me that it's possible to acknowledge the darkness in the world without being consumed by it. To do good work, despite knowing how much evil exists. You're making me sound way more philosophical than I actually am. Am I, though?" Elena tilted her head to look up at him. "You run an organization that could do terrible things, but you've been slowly redirecting it toward more legitimate operations. The clinic is just one example. Marco mentioned that you've been shutting down some of the more violent aspects of the business, focusing on operations that don't hurt people. Don't make me out to be some kind of reformed criminal," Dante warned. "I'm still dangerous, Elena. Still willing to do terrible things to protect what's mine. I know. And I'm not trying to change you or redeem you or whatever. I'm just pointing out that you're changing yourself because you want to be someone worthy of the trust I've placed in you." She wasn't wrong. In the 3 months since Elena had come into his life, truly into his life, not just orbiting around it like before, Dante had made decisions he never would have considered previously, reducing the family's involvement in certain black market operations, being more selective about violence, using it only when absolutely necessary rather than as a first option, even talking to legitimate business consultants about gradually transitioning the Morelli empire toward legal enterprises. It was slow work, and there were plenty of people in the organization who questioned whether he'd gone soft. But Dante was beginning to understand something his father never had. That true strength wasn't about how much fear you could inspire or how much violence you could inflict. It was about having the courage to choose better paths, even when the easy ones beckoned. "You know what I think?" Elena said, interrupting his thoughts. "What?" "I think we're going to be okay, not perfect. We'll have bad days and disagreements and probably some seriously scary moments. But okay, maybe even happy." Dante pulled her closer, marveling at how this small woman had somehow become the center of his universe, without him even noticing it happening. "You were fighting for life and kept saying my name," he reminded her. "You could have called for anyone. Your mother, your friends. Anyone. But you called for me. Because somewhere deep down, I knew you'd come. That you'd move heaven and earth to keep me safe. And you did." "I always will," Dante promised. "That's not romance or hyperbole, Elena. That's a promise from someone who understands the weight of promises. You're under Morelli protection now, which means the full resources of my organization stand between you and anything that might hurt you." "Even you?" Elena asked gently. "Especially me." They sat there in comfortable silence as the city lights glimmered outside the windows. Two people from impossible worlds who'd somehow found each other in the darkness. A mob boss learning that power wasn't everything. A nurse teaching him that caring wasn't weakness. Two scarred souls deciding that together they might actually be whole. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be complications, rival organizations testing boundaries, law enforcement asking uncomfortable questions, the constant balancing act between Dante's world and Elena's work. But for the first time in his life, Dante found himself looking forward to the future rather than simply surviving it. Because Elena had been right. She'd fought for life and called his name, and in saving her, he'd somehow saved himself too.